Hey everyone! Before we begin today's episode, I would like to remind you guys again to please check out some of my other YouTube channels in the description down below. I have a Star Wars Battlefront 2 Classic Focus channel where I review custom maps and mods on the Battlefront Max channel. I do gaming reviews on the Kanoa Reviews channel, and I've also recently started a Minecraft adventure channel where I play through classic adventures with friends. You can find the links in the description, and please subscribe to those channels if you like what you see. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the episode. Fighting for the Imperial-held city had been going on for weeks. Though the Imperium had suffered very few defeats, the fierce Orks drew ever closer to the city walls. Evacuation of the citizens had been initiated, and mostly completed, for the higher-ups feared that in one particular opening the Orks might break through. A small part of the wall was destroyed, and the Imperium had their guard create a quick makeshift guard force here, accompanied by a few sentinels, turrets, and a Leman Russ used as a static turret also. Armored reinforcements were underway, Intel said, but would probably not reach them in time, as before them stood the mighty army of the Orks. Each and every one of them craved the feeling of combat, the warmth of blood on their hands. Time and time, the Orks would throw themselves again onto the Imperium of Man, and though they suffered incredible losses, they managed to reach all the way to the city's edge, defining in their minds that they were doing something right. Their growls and war shouts could be heard all across the battlefield, resulting in some Imperial Guard to shiver in fear, though few dared to show it. They had heard that their chances were bleak, but also knew that the commissars that were present would shoot anyone who'd even try to run. The commissars ordered their men to stand and fight in the name of the Emperor, that they were what stood between the Orks and the entrance to the city, and that the city could never, ever fall under the dirty hands of the Greenskins. And then one particular shout could be heard above all others, and the ground began to shake, as the Green Horde started to move. The order was given by the war boss for his boys to start the attack. Many could not control themselves, made sounds that were close to mania to those never having fought in a battle against them. Their weapons were pointed straight forward, ready to shred the enemy. As the ground shook more and more, every Imperial Guard held its breath. They were coming. Then footsteps could be heard by a handful of Imperial Guard who could not take the stress as they ran down the trench. What followed were loud screams of the commissars, followed by perfectly aimed shots and the sounds of bodies being dropped. An example of what would happen to anyone trying to run. As the Orks reached the range of the Imperium's weapons, the signal was given to unleash hell upon their enemies. The Orks welcomed the slaughter as some increased their tempo as they ran into the burning blasts. Immediately, Orks were shredded all over the battlefield, with literal chunks flying all over the place. But the sound of explosion and death were like music to most, and many never lowered their weapons as all they desired was to fire it upon their doomed enemy. The Imperial Guard, on the other hand, experienced real terror. It was once said that the average lifespan of an Imperial Guard is 15 hours, but for these men, it was closer to 15 seconds. Clouds of red blood spew all over the trenches as many were sent to an early grave before they even knew what hit them. The craters from earlier impacted artillery actually worked as cover for the Orks, hiding even the biggest among them. This made it possible to get ever closer and closer, making their aim more effective. Within the chaos, the Imperial Guards had no idea if they were doing real damage against the Ork charge. People died left and right, and many fired panicked frenzies all around them. The shouts of the commissars were muffled by explosions and the Ork screams. More Imperial Guard ran in fear, and though the commissars did notice this, it was difficult to shoot every last one of them within the chaos. As a matter of fact, the Imperial Guard were actually able to take down a whole bunch of incoming Orks. But the problem with Orks is that there are always more. Despite taking losses, The deafening sound of their war shouts did not diminish, still striking fear in the hearts of their tiny adversaries. As they got closer and closer, they now managed to get past the final craters, meaning they were now eye to eye with the Imperial Guard. Some of the men had never fought orcs before and were startled by their size and terrorizing impression. It became here very apparent how underwhelming their firepower was, as they were forced to use scouting gear in a defensive state. Continued to fight on bravely. Their battle had already been lost, as the trench itself was taken and the first of the greenskins were entering the city. But none on the left flank ever left their post, as they kept firing at the orcs, who were delighted that more potential victims presented themselves. Despite their valiant attempt, these Imperial Guard were no match for the orcs. They lost most of their turret support and simply had too few in number to really hurt the orcs. Yet still none ran, and they all stood the ground to the last man. The orcs then started to focus entirely on entering the city, its inner defensive units already firing onto the battlefield. Word had reached High Command that the city had been breached. They indeed expected reinforcements to not arrive in time, but they were not panicked yet. It had been confirmed that the Astartes were being sent in to deal with the situation in the city. They would make sure to eradicate the greenskins from within, while the armor originally meant to head towards the walls would be sent somewhere else. For at the same time, across a large sprawling field ahead of the city, more battles were being fought, and a different orc army was about to charge after one of their ships had crashed into the ground. They had some heavier units here, and the artillery station for the Imperial Guard was broken. The orcs knew that the city had been breached, taunting the puny humans in front of them, slurring that they would soon join the others in the grave. Especially since this particular guard force was even more underpowered compared to the makeshift defensive unit. The Imperium could not afford a second Ork attack from a different flank on the city, but they also knew that backup was necessary. On the question, "What are your orders, my lord?" High Command answered, "Send in the Baneblades." The Orks were on the move. For weeks, the forces of the Imperium of Man had been clashing with the Greenskins, and despite victories, mostly belonging to the Imperium, part of the Ork horde had managed to get its way into the city. After a makeshift defense force was unable to keep them out, a second army was out for blood at a different flank on the battlefield to head towards the city. And this army was even bigger than the one that attacked the wall, including having motorized weapon support and a few of their walkers. The Imperial Guard that was stationed here had one big disadvantage. Their artillery had broken down due to earlier attacking attempts, and all that was left was infantry, making this a sure loss as the other army at least had turrets and armor at its disposal. But word had it that the Baneblades were heading their way, surely shredding the Orks once they would arrive. They would be there in just a few minutes, so they just had to hold out for a short amount of time. But even a few minutes can be too much to ask when facing a horde of greenskins that all traverse upon you at the same time. Instead of trenches, the Imperium of Man had a few tiny barricades and some last-minute cover with sandbags to protect them, but the protection was laughable. As the Orks traversed the field, with every last one of them screaming to their heart's content, sounds of dying Imperial Guard could be heard amongst it. The Imperial Guard behind the barricades were lined up nicely for the Orks to slaughter, as many of them died before they were even able to fire a single shot. Those that were able to muster the courage to peek above the protective cover were able to find their targets more easily as there were no craters present, but they did not get a lot of time to aim and fire. But the Imperial Guard held their line with very few men fleeing, much to the approval of the commissars that were present. But another reason for this was probably because if they would run, they would die even quicker due to being in the open and a much easier target. The Imperial Guard that were straight ahead of the Orks and parallel to the ones behind the protective barriers also opened fire as their distance was still far enough to where they could take a few more seconds to pick their targets. The commissars here vowed that they were the true force of firepower in this army, whereas the ones behind the barricades were mere distractions for the Orks so that they could be slaughtered by the men here. And though indeed the men stationed here were able to mow down the first row of Orks that headed their way, the tidal wave of greenskins that followed soon proved too much for them as well. Literal chunks of man were being spread all over the battlefield. The ease at which they died increased as fewer and fewer men were present. Only a husk of the fighting force that once stood here was left, and all that in a matter of a few minutes. This gave the Orks the room to spread out around the battlefield as the roaring engines of the Baneblade reinforcements could be heard. The message of reinforcements was received and went through everybody's comms like a ray of hope. As they saw the behemoths roll in slowly, many shouted with joy and praised the Emperor in all its glory. This fueled some to become a bit more aggressive, and even careless, with a few in taking the Orks under fire again. Despite their hearts being filled with hope, the Orks did not care for this, and blasted many of them into a bloody mess. And with that, the Imperial Guard infantry force had virtually been eliminated from this particular battlefield. New reinforcements were behind the Baneblades, but for now, the tanks would act as battering rams and deal with the Orks as a whole. The horde of Orks headed straight for the Baneblades, giving the crew inside a good amount of targets to choose from. Though it might seem unwise to those who first lay eyes upon the Ork infantry charging tanks, one always has to realize that an Ork does not know fear. This can be both a valuable trait, but also a wasteful one. The fire coming from the Orks could not even be compared to pricks of a needle on rock, and those who were still alive and behind the barricades now hurried towards the tanks to use them as cover. Not everyone made it in time, and those who befell an early death did so in a puff of red blood appearing as smoke. The Orks charged headfirst towards the Baneblades, so much so that they did not even get out of the way as it moved forward. Many an Ork got crushed like jelly by its heavy tracks that would stop for nothing and no one. The fearsome Orks, all of a sudden, did not seem that tough anymore. The battlefield now was piling up Ork bodies left and right, making way for the Imperial Guard that was doing all the dying up until then. With its side gunners concentrating on individual Ork infantry, the main gunners would deal with the Ork walkers that created a constant barrage of fire which was still not able to even dent the Baneblade's outsides. As most of the Orks on the field had been dealt with, more Ork shouts could be heard in the distance as a new wave was sent in to deal with tanks. A foolish and petty attempt at an attack, since none of them had weaponry that could destroy something mighty as a Baneblade, but not a single Ork hesitated as they ran in there towards bloodshed. At this distance, they were easy pickings for the tank crew, and many died way before they even got close to the tanks. Some of the walkers were still standing, and those in charge ordered them immediately destroyed, as they could be seen as encouragements for more Orks to attack, as they were so easily distinguished on the battlefield. And so it was done, as hell was unleashed upon the Orks commanding these, as they went out in a blaze of fire and scorching heat. And so the battle was won thanks to the input of the Baneblades, but the overall siege was not yet over. The Baneblades and reinforcing infantry would continue to secure the outer perimeter of the wall, while inside the city, the Blood Ravens would deal with the Orks that got through. Besides just Bloodraven Space Marines, Dreadnoughts and Whirlwind Artillery would be sent in also. The Imperial Guard had already set up defensive positions in the streets against the Orc army that had won at the first Battle of the Wall. But the streets were narrow, and the forces could not spread out, making it more ideal for charging Orcs, and the Imperial Guard in and of itself even less effective. But this time, they had the Space Marines at their side, and they were confident in their ability to eradicate the Orc threat from the city. And then, if successful, the final battle to drive the Orcs off the open field would commence. The battle for the city was about to commence. After a victory on the open field, and able to secure the wall around the city itself, the Imperium of Man now had to deal with the Orc army that managed to get through and confront them in the streets. The Blood Ravens had arrived to clear them out, and some of them had aligned themselves along the Imperial Guard for morale purposes. But this street would be hit hard, as the Orcs were right in front of them, and the narrowness of the streets made it to where the Imperium could not get a good perimeter set up. But backup, in the form of whirlwinds and dreadnoughts, were on their way via a detour through some wider areas. The Orcs themselves were pumped up for another slaughter. They had tasted blood and victory before, and were ready for more. This time, they had some Orcs amongst them that were equipped with shields, to assure them to get close and personal with their enemy. Once again, the war boss joined them at the front, and with a loud roar, he gave the order to attack. Some of the Orcs could barely restrain themselves, as they saw the opposing forces so close to their position. Immediately, rockets were shot all over, finding most of their targets in the form of the Imperial Guard that colored the streets red with their blood once more. The Space Marines kept their composure. They were at the front, functioning as a shield for the regular infantry, though many a bullet pierced its way through an Imperial Guard's armor. Having the Orcs this close meant that it was easy for the Space Marines to shoot the incoming greenskins. But with each step closer towards the Imperium's forces, the Orcs became deadlier and deadlier. Despite the Space Marines being able to handle the incoming fire, a few were blown off their feet due to the impact of the rockets. But they were out for just a few seconds before recomposing themselves and joined their brothers in glorious combat once more. By now, some of the Orcs with their shields had made it up to the Imperium's perimeter. They would soon engage in melee combat and prevent them from shooting at the ever-increasing horde that flooded the streets. Combat was chaotic and messy, with the Space Marines at the rear still firing while their battle brothers crushed the skulls of the Orcs with their fists at the front. But many had died in this short fight already. The Imperial Guard suffered terrible losses like they always did. The streets were littered with green Orc bodies shot to pieces. And between the fighting that was still happening, even the lifeless bodies of Space Marines and their scouts could be seen. But then the Blood Ravens and Imperial Guard were ordered to quickly get out of there. Their whirlwind artillery had arrived and was given green light to cover the area in scorching heat. And as the rockets left the whirlwinds, they came down on the Orcs with furious anger. Blinding flashes and deafening explosions signaled the destruction of the Orcs. The Imperial Guard that was still alive and watched from afar were at awe on how easily the Orks died. Against the Imperium's artillery, the Orks seemed like mere ants, being blown to bits left and right. The Imperium infantry rejoiced and praised the Emperor as they saw the Ork war boss burn, its metal components melting into its skin, preventing it to move, be cooked slowly to a crisp. Once the dust had settled, a glorious display of victory presented itself in the form of hundreds of dead Orks. Despite such devastation, there were still Orks out there that were capable of fighting. These Orks were still a threat to regular Imperial guardsmen, but the Imperium sent in their dreadnoughts to do the cleaning. These units housed fallen battle brothers. They were put in these walkers like a metal sarcophagus, so that they could serve the Emperor once more. And they would gladly do so. As the Orks stormed their way, the dreadnoughts greeted them with soul-crushing fire. Cheering could be heard all throughout the city as the light provided by the fire illuminated victory to all others around the perimeter. Now, the final battle for the city and its surrounding battlefield was about to commence. Outside the city walls, a final Ork army of different forces had combined to perform one final assault and infiltrate the city once more. They brought more armor and even some stolen and converted assets from the Imperium as well. But this time the Imperium of Man was sure to finish the fight. Besides the regular infantry, space marines, and armor support, they had also called in the help of an Imperial Knight. This war machine was often put on the battlefield in a squad. For this particular battle, one should be enough. The Knight was controlled by one pilot, a human belonging to a long-lasting aristocratic family. Its presence would work even as a greater banner of hope and morale than the Baneblades or regular Space Marines did. They were about to face the Ork horde head-on. The Orks had made several openings in the surrounding barrier through which they could move their regular infantry that already opened fire on the enemies they saw before them. Despite a lot of fireworks going off on both sides, the battle itself was very one-sided, despite looking chaotic to the unwatchful eye. The Imperium of Man did a great job at keeping the Orks at bay. Despite taking severe losses amongst their Imperial Guard, and even some of their armor, there was never a feeling or threat of losing. This mostly was because of the towering Knight. As long as the aristocratic unit was still on two legs and slaughtering Orks in the name of the Emperor, they were convinced they were winning the battle. The open field did give the Orks the opportunity to quickly spread out like cockroaches, therefore making it more difficult to pick them off all bunched up as they came through the surrounding barrier. Commissars ordered their men to move forward, but a few Space Marines here and there raised their fists to boost the morale of the Imperial Guard to keep on fighting. On their left flank, the Imperial Guard actually took very few losses due to the presence of good cover. Some of the Orks that were running across the battlefield did not seem to notice that their forces had almost been dealt with entirely. Within the chaos, a few Space Marines lost their lives as well, though most suffered mere bruises or flesh wounds. The explosions and upsweeping dirt made it very difficult to keep track of what was going on, even now. But as the Imperium infantry dealt with the opposing infantry, the Knight dealt with the last of the enemy armor. And thus, the final battle for the city was won, and victory went to the Imperium of Man. The war for the planet was far from over, and the wrecks and bodies of fallen men and Ork would be rooted in its soil as memories of the past and omens of what was to come. Despite the victory, it was a question if the city would be livable again, due to the high chance of Orc spores being present now. But this was what the armies of the Imperium of Man did. They spilled blood in the name of the Emperor. They did so for many generations, and would continue to do so for many more. A city lost would not diminish victories over the Orcs in any shape or form, for in the future, there's only war. And not only on this planet, for the conflict of the Imperium of Man stretched over many different galaxies, and in wars with many different enemies, some more human-like than others. And then there were those resembling beasts with many limbs, claws, and rows of razor-sharp teeth. Much more blood would have to be spilled on all sides of this great war, with each faction fighting for what they believed in, for whoever they worshipped, and in whom they trusted. Everyone fought for a different reason, whether it was extermination, complete dominance, the greater good, or simply their inherent right as the first rulers. And in the end, there was always chaos. Hey everyone, and thank you very much for watching this 3-part mini-series that I did with the Warhammer 40K mod for Man-of-War Assault Squad 2. It got a lot of praise from many of you, and I was very happy with the response. Some of you actually thought that this was part of the Halo vs. Star Wars vs. Warhammer series, but that is not the case. This is just a standalone mini-series. The reason why I wanted to make this is because the earlier mentioned Arma 3 series had gotten some critique by Warhammer fanboys that thought the mod did not represent the Warhammer universe very well. Personally, I think we should be just happy with having a mod for a tactical modern shooter to begin with, but a few things that people criticized were the size of the Orks, how underpowered Space Marines were, and lack of vehicles available like a Baneblade. Because of that, I wanted to make this series to see if those complaining would respond a bit better, and they indeed did so. The Orks, for example, do not only have more models available here, but they behave more like Orks. In Arma, which is all about tactical shooting, the Orks often go prone, which is not very Orc-like according to many comments, but the AI in Arma is simply programmed to do so. Here, that is not the case, where the Orks all run towards the enemy and shoot at the same time. They even have some melee weapons and animations in here too. There were also more units available on the other sides, like the Imperium of Man finally had the Baneblade that so many people wanted to see, which is currently not yet present in the Arma 3 mod, even though there are videos on YouTube many years ago where you can actually see the Baneblade in there, but I think it's support from the Arma 2 mod. There are also things like Knights and Dreadnoughts that cannot be found in the Arma mod. However, in this particular mod, they do not have Titans, where the Arma 3 mod does have the Warhound Titan. That is why I think both mods have the right to exist, as they both offer different experiences with different units and different gameplay mechanics, like the possibility to experience a cool Warhammer battle in first person with the Arma 3 mod. What I like most about this Man of War Warhammer mod is just the spectacle it offers, with all the lasers, rockets, explosions, and blood and gore that makes it just a feast to watch. Units like the Space Marines are in this mod also way harder to kill than the Arma one, despite some of them dying in this series as well. But then again, if one were to look at the cinematics of Dawn of War and Dawn of War 2, actually quite a lot of Space Marines die, so I believe some people make them out to be a little bit more powerful than they ought to be, as they are not invincible. As you saw by the end of this episode, this mod also offers more factions for us to make cool cinematics with, and I was wondering what you guys wanted to see next. I will use the same format, so it's going to be a mini-series of 3, maybe 4 episodes. Personally, I am leaning towards a Tyranid mini-series, purely because they are not in the Arma mod and would make for a complete, unique series where they actually also work like Tyranids in this game with swarming the enemy faction. As you could see, there are also many other factions though. I do have to say that the Necrons do not have that many units available in this mod, so if I were to make a series of that, the battles might get a bit stale after 2 or 3 repeats. I think Chaos we should keep for a cool climax or finale, as they have some really cool units available there. But let me know what you guys thought of this miniseries and what enemy you want the Imperium of Man to face next. Thank you all so much for the support, and see you guys next time.